Welcome to the Continuing Education module, Trends in Employer Wellness Programming, a snapshot of current employer wellness efforts. Our agenda for this module includes our definition of wellness, characterization of the employer community, results of major national surveys, characterization of major segments, including the very small employer, the small employer, the medium-sized employer, the large employer, and the very large employer. And then looking ahead, and finally, a summary of main points. Our definitions of wellness include wellness as an intentional choice of a lifestyle characterized by personal responsibility, moderation, and maximum personal enhancement of physical, mental, and financial health. That's the orientation that we take to wellness. A worksite wellness program we define as an organized program primarily for the worksite population. It may not necessarily be limited to the worksite setting, that is intended to assist employees and their family members in making voluntary behavior changes that reduce their health and injury risk, improve their health consumer skills, and enhance their individual and family wellness, and productivity and well-being. So these are the context for our definition of wellness and our definition of worksite wellness programs. Now, the composition of the American workforce is reflected in this Bureau of Labor Statistics information. On the left-hand side, you see the pie chart of the civilian employees in the U.S. labor force. There's 159 million individuals in that labor force, and they are distributed in terms of the numbers of employees in the firms that employ them by the numbers that you see. So 25% of that 159 million work for organizations with fewer than 20 employees. That's what we call very small. The next group is the 20 employees to 99 employees, and that constitutes approximately 30% of the employee workforce. And that, by the way, when you combine the 25 and the 30 together, you get about 55%. So 55%, or the majority of the U.S. labor force, works for what would classically be called a small organization. They're under 100 employees. Another 25% of that civilian labor force works in organizations that are 100 to 499 employees, and another 7% in that 500 to 999, and then approximately 13% in the 1,000 plus category. So that's the distribution of employees in the labor force, in the U.S. labor force, by the size organizations they work for. On the right-hand side of the slide, you will see the approximate number of employers by the size of their group. So the blue group, which is under 20, constitutes 6.2 million employers. That's where most of our employers are. The next group, the green group, is the 20 to 99. That's another 835,000. Then it drops down to 149,000. And then the following group is 11,000. And then the 1,000 plus is at 7,100. So the context here is that we have lots of employers, there are lots of employees, and all of them are distributed in organizations where the majority tend to be in smaller organizations. Now let's look at a sector composition of our labor force. And again, this is Bureau of Labor Statistics data. And what you can see in terms of millions of employees are the numbers of people that are employed in the various major sectors. So the healthcare sector has certain requirements that are kind of unique for wellness programs. Since you're generally working with people that have exposure to many of the clinical issues in healthcare, it oftentimes requires more subtle and sometimes more powerful incentives around wellness due to the fact that many healthcare workers know they should be doing something healthy for themselves but don't choose to do that. So there are some unique design needs in the health context. In the retail context, we're generally talking about small settings and small sites. So our wellness program needs to be adapted to many remote sites with relatively small numbers of people. The manufacturing area tends to have programming that is oriented toward not being work invasive because of the importance of the production function around the manufacturing of goods and services. And the administrative sector tends to be people that are familiar with computerization, tend to be more highly trained or highly educated, and that has some implications for design of wellness programs. The food service industry tends to be lower income, lower wage workers, perhaps lower education levels as well, and probably more of a challenge related to translation issues, language of origin, cultural differences in terms of wellness. Professional area are where we're generally looking at advanced degrees and or professional education. Obviously has its own challenges related to how much information and what depth of information and sophistication of information you provide in your wellness program. The construction industry tends to be outdoor work, and it also tends to have highly paid workers, but workers that don't necessarily have a high level of education. So their needs and wellness interests are oftentimes different. They're also getting usually a lot of physical activity in during the day, so they may have some different interests in terms of the topics and targets that we generally include in wellness programs. Another group is the financial and insurance group, and that tends to be looking more like the admin group, but this is also where tends to have a high degree of computerization, high computer literacy. Usually education levels are fairly high. These are people that like numbers and like to know their numbers. So those are some of the issues that drive that particular sector's wellness efforts. The wholesale community is generally working in settings that are warehouses or distribution centers, or the transportation activities around wholesale and warehouse activity, maybe delivery trucks. Transportation tends to be long distance hauls, short hauls, as well as working in the railroad and railroad settings, as well as some air transportation. So again, some unique challenges for those populations. The information industry tends to be people that have, again, high computer literacy, tend to be more highly educated, and likely to be needing more depth in their incentive approach. And then the others are in a category that includes things that don't fit into these sectors of our economy and our labor force activity. Now, this particular graphic is a summary of 4 national surveys that were conducted in 85, 92, 99, and 2004. We're still waiting for the 5th one to occur, and it will essentially give us some information about the types of programs and the areas of targeting and focus of those employer wellness programs. These have generally been to organizations with more than 50 employees. So the numbers that you see at the bottom are the numbers of employers that were involved in the survey process. And then it shows you the percentage of those respondents by the 4 cycles of survey activity that actually addressed the specific topics that you see over on the left. And basically you see trending that is either in decline, holding the same, or going up. So as you look at the various areas, also the NA means that those issues were not examined or questions were not asked of the employers that completed the survey work. So again, you can see some of that kind of activity. I would probably suggest to you that it isn't that we, in fact, are addressing all of these needs to the point that they don't need to be addressed anymore. It's generally just a shift in emphasis and a shift in popularity or perception of what is of interest. So these areas will probably continue to be needed as we then move through various generational groups and of composition, demographic composition of our work population. Again, this is national data. It's conducted by the Office of Health Promotion, Disease Prevention, and these have been sponsored and carried out by various organizations, but with similar methodology. So this allows us to see from a summary context what the targeting issues have been in the worksite wellness movement over the last 3 decades. The big 8 wellness targets, you've seen this perhaps in other parts of our material, but the idea that these 8 areas, the first 6 being more chronic disease prevention, the last 2 being things that will affect the spend under the healthcare plan more quickly. So those are more shorter term economic yield or economic effect targets. And then it also shows you the disease conditions that they tend to be associated with. These are the clinical areas of importance to the wellness field. And the possible interventions that you see are the ways in which we address these particular kinds of areas of targeting. So this gives you the perspective that I would probably suggest that all employers need to have, which is this is probably a core of what your wellness program should be addressing, given the characteristics and the needs of our working populations. Now, let's start on a characterization. Let's start with the very small employer first, with under 20 employees. And they constitute somewhere around 25% of the 159 million people working in the U.S. civilian labor force. First of all, these organizations tend to have smoke-free policies, much of that growing out of the Clean Air Acts that have been passed in various states and jurisdictions. If their health plan coverage is in place, they would generally have access to some educational resources. So even in the small context, you can find your way to some educational resources, oftentimes through your health plan. There may be a preventive medical benefit. That's been one of the newer requirements under the ACA, and now will be changing as we move post-ACA era. And that preventive medical benefit offers some opportunity to have reimbursement and coverage for those preventive screening activities. Generally clean and equipped break rooms, so they're provided with refrigerators and microwaves and providing some of the ability for us to eat in a healthy context, even in the very small work site. Largely informational programming, so the access may be through a website, or it may be through materials that are distributed, maybe by a health plan, or through an HR or owner that passes out things for their employee. There may be some safety practices that are germane to the type of work involved. So there's some issues around safety and workers' comp, Department of Industry and Labor that would have a concern expressed through some compliance activities on the part of these small organizations. They would depend a lot on the health plan. So these particular types and sizes of employers have a high degree of dependency on what the health plan can in fact provide when it comes to wellness and well-being. In addition, I'm going to suggest some things that will be in blue type on the following sheets, on this sheet and the following sheets, that could in fact enhance what is being done by this particular area of type of employer. And a wellness newsletter would in fact be potentially a good device for this small size employer. The use of posters with issues that are germane to particular health observances, providing some sort of activity option where they can either have a chair massage, someone come in and do a chair massage even in this small setting, and or some sort of walking event or a healthy lunch that's served and paid for by the employer. So there are some activities that we could augment wellness activities that are typical in the top of the list with those blue items that are in the bottom of the list. The next area we're going to characterize are the small employer, the 20 to 99 employees. Generally, smoke-free policies, again, flowing out of those Clean Air Acts. Health plan coverage, again, providing some educational resources, again, the preventive medical benefit, clean and equipped break room and lunchroom, periodic activity focus. So this is a situation where there may be either a screening program or flu shots that are brought in, but there's periodic activities that support wellness. And again, we could enhance what takes place in these smaller settings with a wellness newsletter, perhaps with some screening option periodically where we bring into the worksite the opportunity for people to get a wellness assessment or a well-being assessment, and the opportunity to perhaps complete an online health risk assessment or well-being survey through the health insurer for this size group plan. So these are, again, some of the options and alternatives in blue and the fairly typical items that are in the top of the list. Now let's characterize the employer wellness activity for the medium-sized employer, and this is in 100 to 499 employees, just short of 500. Again, smoke-free policy, health plan coverage with more educational resources in this particular sector. So oftentimes health plans have resources that are targeted on this size employer. There may well be a dedicated wellness portal or e-health portal that's used. A preventive medical benefit is more likely to be in place. Clean and equipped break rooms again, and lunch rooms. Lunch and learn programs, so perhaps something that is provided to employees for learning and education around various health topics. Annual health fair would not be atypical in this kind of environment where a health plan and or other types of community vendors would be essentially organizing and putting on a health fair. Sometimes the health fair will be for a area where there are multiple businesses, perhaps in a building or in a block of industrial activities and industrial building sites. So that's an annual health fair. Walking program would probably not be unusual in this size organization, perhaps more informal than formal. So, but the idea that the encouraging of employees to do some consistent activity during the day in terms of walking. The opportunities we have in wellness to add to this particular level of employer wellness activity is probably to add a screening option periodically, to also perhaps have an on-site physical activity program that can provide some opportunity for people to stretch, to do some simple resistance training, and or do some aerobic activity. In addition, this is oftentimes a type of size organization where health insurers or health plans will provide a health risk assessment or a well-being survey option for employees to complete. This also is a type of setting, and the number of employees involved would lend themselves to an on-site weight management program. And finally, some interest and in some opportunity being able to look at the healthy food choices that employees have during the workday associated with either food trucks that visit the location or cafeteria or services that are provided by an outside vendor where it's close to the work site and they walk to it, and or a more extensive lunchroom and area where people can heat up food and store food in a safe and healthy manner. So again, these are some of the characterization of this medium-sized employer with the items at the top of the list, and then the blue items can be enrichments that would be fairly rare with this particular population, but would in fact, I think, fit well in terms of a constellation of wellness activities. Now let's characterize the large employer, and for the large employer, we're putting in that category employers that have anywhere from 500 to maybe 2,500 employees. And again, smoke-free policy, again related to the Clean Air Acts, the health plan coverage, having more major access to educational resources, preventive medical benefit, walking program, on-site physical activity program, wellness portal or e-health portal, on-site weight management program, Dedicated staffing, and this is probably where you would find people that have a dedicated role. Oftentimes they are coming with some expertise in terms of organizing wellness programs, or they may be someone that's self-taught and essentially part of an HR department that is dedicated to the wellness program. Screening options can occur periodically, and those can be of different types. Lunch and Learn program would also be a potential for this particular size employer. And then having a health risk assessment and or well-being survey option through a health insurer. Healthy food options again, and the context for some expansion of what is typical. I think the top list are fairly typical characterization of these larger employers would be to add something like a premium reduction incentive, where if they are more involved in the wellness activities, they in fact get some benefit to a lower cost health plan purchase. And telephone-based wellness coaching would be another intervention that would fit well with this size employer. Having a learning management system, and that's where we essentially use computerization and video and all of the self-service technology orientation to have ways in which we can impart content to people and have them watch online on their own time or on work time and pick up various content areas. Part of that content area could be a general wellness area, or it could be an injury prevention initiative that's designed to help people look at home injury prevention, vehicular injury prevention, and recreational injury prevention. Another part of an approach using that learning management system might be a healthcare consumerism, so that people in fact have some resources to help them select physicians, choose when to go to the emergency room or urgent care clinic, how to prepare for visits with providers, how to reduce the issues of patient injury and or patient safety. So there's a lot of different kinds of content that could in fact be put into a learning management system, oftentimes in this size employer setting. And finally, the use of a consumer-directed or consumer-driven health plan with a health savings account feature, possibly with an incentive related to wellness. So the ability to weave, again, these blue items into the context of the items at the top of the list to enrich the wellness activity. But the items at the top of the list, again, I would suggest to you reflect the people who are doing wellness in this particular category of size of employer. Now, the characterization of your very large employer, the 2,500 plus employees, would again have many of the same things that we have seen in the previous. Bringing along with it, though, also some issues around wearables and perhaps more of a focus on the use of wearables connected to an incentive, the use of a health risk assessment and a well-being survey option through a health insurer. Again, healthy food choices and options. Then in a greater integrated programming, so in this larger site, we're looking at ways to make sure all of the interventions that are listed are in fact well integrated with each other, mention each other, make it easy to transition from one setting to another, sign up for programs, stay in touch with various sources of information that are structured around the individual's needs, those kinds of activities. A premium reduction incentive related to health plan and wellness would be another one of the characteristics. Again, telephone-based wellness coaching, the LMS for injury prevention and health consumerism, the CDHP with an HSA kind of orientation. So you see the potential to actually fill out with these much larger organizations more wellness activities. In general, this larger, very large organization has been generally less willing to move to more comprehensive style wellness programs than the category we just dealt with a moment ago, the large employer. So these very large have oftentimes had logistics and delivery challenges that have kept them from being as comprehensive as some of the organizations that are large but not very large. So there's some context here around how we think about what these kinds of organizations can do and how they might better organize and structure their wellness programs activity for their employee populations. Now, I'd like to look at the pattern of employer programming in wellness by the size, and these are the 5 size characteristics in terms of the employers and their employee size. And programming, I'm going to suggest, is very limited programming, probably 5% or more, but not very much. 5, 7, 8, 10, 12% of the very small organizations would in fact be doing the kinds of activities that were in the blue portion of each of the characterizations we just saw, and particularly the characterization around that very small setting. In the small organization, if we look across the country, generally the surveys that have been done show that about 20% or so of these small employers, 21 to 99 employees, tend to have some limited programming, and they would probably parallel the items that you see in that context. But a much higher percentage of them could potentially do more that would include both the items that were at the top of the listing as well as the blue areas for this particular size employer. In the 100 to 499 employee or medium firm, it's moderate amount of programming. About 60% of these sized organizations are doing wellness in some capacity. And that, again, is related to some of the surveys that have been done. There are probably about 25 different studies that I've found that are looking at these different sectors and attempting to estimate how much activity is actually going on in them. I've tried to put all those together for you to give you at least a feel for how much activity is going on in these different sectors of our employer community. And then in the larger organizations, the 500 to 2499, or around 2,500 employees, we call that large. That's fairly extensive programming. So 75% or more are going to have all of the items that we saw on the top of the list for this size category. Not necessarily all the items that are in the blue, but at least that 75% have being and engaging in those items that were on the top of the list. When we get to the very large employer, we really have we're back to more moderate programming levels. So in terms of our approach to the items that you saw at the top of the list for the very large, probably a moderate level of programming, but the amount of potential there is higher because of the size and the scale and the purchasing capability of these larger organizations. So the context again is, as we think about how much we could do, there's the issue of how much is being done in those top items in each of the lists versus those that could in fact expand to and utilize the blue items. And the blue items could push up all of these areas up to 100%. So we have the ability to do them. We lack the will, the desire, and we might say the priority to actually achieve these kinds of levels and patterns of employer programming around wellness. And only about 7% of all employers have results-driven wellness programs. So the kinds of more serious wellness that we generally see is fairly rare. It's going to be, 1 out of 12, 1 out of 15, 1 out of 14, somewhere in that area in terms of the various sizes. Now, most of that's going to be at the medium and above. There's very few in the very small and small. There's a few, but not many. Most of those more results-driven wellness programs are going to reside in the medium-sized, large, and very large employer sector. Now, the overview of employer wellness efforts, if we use this 2x2 analysis, which is allowing us to look at the adequacy of funding on the left and whether the program is actually producing results. And we can say it's ineffective or effective. And the way in which I would probably suggest to you that U.S. employers and all of the things we've just looked at, I would probably say that about 85% of all employer wellness efforts in the U.S. are in A, which means they're underfunded and fairly ineffective. And this is corroborated actually by Michael O'Donnell and some of the work that he has done and written about in the American Journal of Health Promotion, but that number is way too high. We lack also the rest of the other categories are probably about 5% each. So we might have 5% in B that are underfunded, but for some reason, the way in which they're implementing the program is actually producing results. So they've done some things to make what they're doing effective in helping people make changes in long-term behavior. The C would be another 5%. Those are adequately funded, but because of the design or the bias that is shaping what they are attempting to do, they are not necessarily very effective in terms of producing long-term behavior change. And that's what the major issue is in that effective versus ineffective is it producing long-term behavior change? D is where we would like to be. We'd like virtually all of our wellness activities to be adequately funded and doing things in a way that produces long-term behavior change or is effective. But I would probably suggest to you that that's probably where another 5% is. So 85% are in A, 5% are in B, 5% are in C, and about 5% are in D. So that's the unfortunate reality as we look at it from an overview perspective at the various wellness efforts on the part of U.S. employers at the current time. Now, major employer wellness trends looking forward. Here are some of the things that I believe are going to mark the future of wellness in the U.S. One is an increased shift to well-being and toward total health, so that we're not just dealing with physical health issues or mental health issues, but we have expanded our purview to include issues like financial, spiritual, intellectual, cultural, social. So we are continuing to shift, and I believe we will see that in the future during the next decade of a shift toward well-being. I think that we're reducing our clinical and risk focus in our programming. And I think people have had difficulty. They've not invested enough money or enough time and energy, and they don't have enough interventions to have produced the clinical and risk effects that they want, even though we know that they're linked to economic return as well as health improvement. But I believe that the pattern and trend is going to be away from those clinical and risk factor focused issues. The third major trend that I see is increased emphasis on intrinsics and also the sleep related issue, sleep and health. So I think we're going to see more focus on those areas. The intrinsic reasons why I want to affect my own health and well-being, and also the issues of how appropriate and healthy are my sleep related patterns. And then the fourth trend that I see is simplification of targets and programming. So I think people essentially have plateaued. Many of them have plateaued. They're not going to increase the targets they're addressing. They may simplify that by reducing the targets and reducing the amount of programming. Unfortunate, but that is what I see around me. Greater emphasis on community service and the contribution that employees can make to their community and to various philanthropic purposes in our community. So I see that becoming bigger in the wellness context. Another trend is the increased vendorization of programming, and that picked up in the early 2000s and has continued, and that's where the vendor or the employer essentially decides, I'm going to have the vendor do the programming. And in a sense, they're giving up their sense of ownership over the program, which is not good, but it does in fact lead to vendors being able to do more for wellness for people within a particular employer. The problem is it has some inherent disadvantages. So that's the other side of the coin, is that it's led to what I would consider to be simplistic, pretty simplistic kinds of programming that has also produced what we saw in the previous graphic, in the previous slide, about the ineffectiveness of our efforts and the underfunding of our wellness efforts. The next trend that I see is the greater reliance on technology. So the ability to use technology to a higher degree, but not necessarily in a way that's going to lead to long-term behavior change. I think the problems are that our technology tends to give us short-term solutions, but not long-term solutions. Another trend that I see on the horizon is the softening of the economic emphasis that has historically been pretty strong in wellness. It's been ROI oriented, return on investment oriented. And I see that softening now as people have come to question whether they can actually measure the economic effect. Unfortunately, we've had some critics that are not well prepared or not very intellectually honest. So that's created some real dust in the air around the return on investment issues in worksite wellness. And I think there's a growing focus on active engagement, so that we are seeing more of an orientation toward let's engage with employees and let's actually have them be active or doing things that then lead to those longer term behaviors. And I think that unfortunately, another unfortunate issue is that one of the trends I see is people giving up on incentives, again, because of some unfortunate visibility given to proponents and ideologues that don't like incentives. So we have this issue of the focus, the extent of focus on which incentives are used and how to combine different pay values within incentives. There, if you've seen any of the other material in the WellCert program or any of our other continuing education modules on incentives, you know that we talk about 25 different types of pay values that can be brought together in incentive programming. So we tend to be looking more at a mix of extrinsic and intrinsic kinds of sources for motivation. Now let's summarize the key points from this particular module. First of all, there are literally millions of employers of all sizes doing wellness. So there are lots of people doing it. Most employers who address wellness pick from a short list of interventions. They have tended to get stuck doing a preventive screening or an HRA, or they do a health fair, but have not really thought much about other interventions or other targeting strategies. Most employees work for small or very small employers, and that has its own set of wellness challenges. Most employers provide some wellness activities, but few have comprehensive or well-designed programs. And it's been estimated by various sources in the field to be somewhere around 7% of the wellness effort that's out there is more comprehensive, like the results-driven wellness model that we talk about in the WellCert program. The larger the number of employees, the more likely the employer will offer some kind of organized wellness activity. And that's been shown in the 4 national surveys that have been done and additional surveys that have been reported in the literature. Very large companies are just now beginning to provide more comprehensive wellness programs. So what we've seen over time is that the very, very large employer has generally held back, I think primarily because of logistics and cost issues, and the fact that the approaches that they've used for wellness have not been very scalable. They've not been able to be scalable. So until we have some technology, which I believe we have and will have soon, that will allow us to scale these programs, then we will not see as much comprehensiveness of programming in the very large organization. Wellness activities can be adapted to almost any setting and can be expanded as the number of employees increase. So by careful planning, we can essentially take a program and grow it as the number of employees grow. One of the main issues in wellness is the virtual versus site-based, which is how do I deliver wellness to the individual in their home or the spouse that's in the home, and not build a program that is entirely dependent on people being at work. And that's a big issue for us as we think, particularly as we think about the scalability of future wellness efforts. There are a variety of trends now reflected in employer wellness efforts. So we have a lot of trends that are shaping what we currently see on the horizon. Underfunding and ineffective programming are the two main challenges. So these are in that 2x2 analysis we saw. Those are the two issues. The adequacy of funding of our programs. Employers have tended to want to spend very little on wellness, and unfortunately it's produced relatively ineffective programming in many circumstances. And the future of wellness is in personalization, ease, simplicity, and active engagement. So personalization of programming for the individual, ease of use by the individual, along with simplicity of administration by the employer, and an emphasis on active engagement in actual behavior change and in using AMSO, the context that we have talked about, we talk about in the WellCert program, to lead to the long-term behavior change that is really key to the results and achieving the hierarchy of results these programs have an opportunity to do. So these, again, are a summary of key points from this particular module. Now, let's look at some key questions. And our first question is, what are the major wildcards for worksite wellness programming? And these are things that I believe will change the trends which we're currently seeing and which I just shared with you a moment ago. So those wildcards are the uncertainty of the repeal and revision of the ACA and the way in which that's going to play out and be implemented, and what's going to happen to healthcare costs as that is being done. If healthcare costs tend to go up very quickly, I believe it will lead to a resurgence of interest in worksite wellness. The next wild card, I think, is an increased reliance on technology, and I would probably say an over-reliance on technology. So if that in fact occurs and we continue to search after the shiny object syndrome and pursue things that are not really ready for prime time yet, that will have an impact on the trends that shape the field. Also, if we are working and moving toward more virtual type of work, so rather than having people in a specific location, one of the wild cards will be how much virtual work is going to go on in the various sectors in our labor force and the various portions and parts of our economy. The next area of wild card is what happens as the boomers continue to age. And do they stay in the work site? Do they then create demands and challenges for us in terms of how we address their wellness needs? We also have another wild card which is emerging as a bipolar aging pattern. We have our older employees are getting older and our younger employees are getting younger. So they are moving to opposite ends, what's called a bipolar distribution. So that will in fact be an important wild card in the trends and shaping the trends that I feel are in the field of wellness. The next area of wild card is the generational differences and the unique aspects of motivation, of expectations around work norms, and issues around how individuals in different generational groups, the millennials, the boomers, the X generation, all of the busters, the people that are in different age categories, bringing into the work site different sets of values and norms. The next area of wild card, I think, is our economic instability. If our economy goes through adjustments and ends up being more economically unstable or unstable, then I think that's going to have some impact on the trends that we generally see guiding and shaping what we do in worksite wellness. The next area of wild card, I think, is the issue of risk factors, the traditional risk factors and newer risk factors. and whether they in fact increase and significantly increase in various major generational groups in our populations. So if we do in fact see a growth of those risk factors and we see the economic consequences of those, then our wellness programs are likely to need to bring up new targeting and new sets of interventions to address those. And finally, another wild card is the extent to which American business and the leadership in our organizations and in our government and in the various nonprofit sectors, the way in which they look at human capital. For a while, I thought that human capital was going to become a larger part of the thinking of management, but it has not necessarily progressed very far. So a wild card is how much additional interest and focus will people have on human capital development and human capital management in terms of how that affects what we do in the worksite wellness space. Our second question is, what current trends in the field should be reversed in your view? And there are 6 that I would suggest, or 7 that I would suggest should be reversed. These are things that I think are trends, but I think they're going in the wrong direction. First of all, I think that the trend of reduced clinical and risk factor orientation in programming actually should be increasing rather than decreasing. So that's the first trend that I feel should be reversed. The second trend that I feel should be reversed is simplification of targeting and interventions. I think that if we want to achieve more in terms of results of our programs, we're going to have to increase the number of targets and the types of interventions and the options for interventions that we have and offer to populations. So that's the second trend that I believe should be reversed. The third trend that I think needs to be reversed is vendorization of our programming. I think that we have moved too far to make it easy on employers by having vendors essentially have the ownership over programs. And I think that that has removed the employer from an active role and led to the plateauing of a lot of our wellness efforts. The fourth trend that I think needs to be reversed is the over-reliance on technology. Technology can be wonderful for us in terms of scalability of programs, but if the technology is not able to bring about long-term behavior change and to support it, then that scalability has limited value long-term. So I think we tend to have an over-reliance on the technology. It's like what I've seen happen with pedometers and wearables, as everybody jumps on them when they come into the market. But after a while, you look around and you find very few people using pedometers and using wearable technology and remote technology. The next area of trend that I think should be reversed is the softening toward the economic emphasis that these programs have had since their beginning. I believe that the economic issue is a big issue for the long-term continuance and stability and sustainability of worksite wellness activity. And finally, the last trend that I would suggest needs to be reversed is the loss of focus on incentives. I think we have taken a very simplistic view toward incentives, and we really need to step back and say, what are the pay values that should be incorporated into a wellness program that actually leads to a building of the intrinsic base of motivation, and that extrinsic and intrinsic have a relationship with each other, and they are much more dynamic than our researchers and psychologists have in fact postulated for us and researched for us. So I think that that is one of the issues that, again, needs to be reversed. So those are the 7 issues that I would suggest, or 6 issues that I would suggest are trends that I think need to be reversed in terms of the field. Last question is, in your view, what will the future of worksite wellness look like? And I think that the future of the field that I think of has the following characteristics. 1, a very strong well-being emphasis, downplaying the clinical and risk issue, but still addressing them, but really talking about those clinical issues as they relate to the individual's sense of well-being. The second issue is that I think we will be using the smartphone, our smartphones, as our primary platform for engaging people around wellness. And I believe that what we will be doing is using text messaging, email messaging, and voicemail messaging to work with people around the intrinsic reasons why they want to make a change. In addition, another one of the characteristics of the future, I think, is that we will be using what I would call DRIP, well-being surveys or well-being assessments. And probably on a quarterly basis, getting a short survey on your smartphone that allows you to pick an area that you might want to work on and then think about why you want to work on it. And then indicate that, and then receive as a result of that a set of offers. And that's another part of what I see in the future for wellness, is that we need to be crafting offers which are more attuned to that individual, what we know about them. And I think that this is really comes out of our e-commerce and our online marketing technology and its application to wellness. And then another one of the characteristics that I see in the future of wellness is providing decision support on those offers. So if I say that I want to do one of those offers, then I get some messages reminding me about it and helping me make sure that I get to the offer that I choose to want to do. So I think that decision support on the offers is another part of what the future will hold. In addition, I think that as a wellness program manager, I can expect to have fairly complete dashboards on engagement and engagement metrics, so that I am watching those engagement metrics as one of my primary ways of managing the wellness efforts for individuals. The next thing that I think is part of the future of wellness is the use of an annual wellness visit, like the one that was introduced in Medicare through the ACA. I was involved in that expert panel that was involved in setting that up. But the idea that each individual should have an annual wellness visit that incorporates some personal wellness objectives and a review of their health and risk issues, and the ability to put it all together in a way that relates to that individual's needs and interests and preferences and readiness to change. Another one of the characteristics I think it needs to be there is a health coach that can also work on our wellness activity, but also our medical self-care needs, our consumer health education needs, and how those things play out in our own life and our own symptomatology. And then another one of the characteristics is the use of a criteria-based premium reduction approach to our health plan, so that we can in fact benefit from a lower health plan purchase cost on a monthly basis or a weekly or pay period basis that is connected to our being on the wellness bus, if you will. And finally, the ability to have more of a campaign-oriented approach to specific types of behavior change that kind of connect the dots between the smartphone phone platform and then this DRIP HRA and a series of email, text, and voicemail messages that come to me as an employee. So if that vision of the future resonates with you, please give me a call or send me an email, because I'll basically let you know how you can do this in your own situation. So that's the answers that I have for these three particular questions on this particular module in our CE series. Now that you completed this continuing education module, go ahead and take the quiz.